I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between belief and the way in which people write and think about literature. So this week, for example, I'm teaching a number of writers, including the late 19th and early 20th century writer, Anglo-Irish writer W.B. Yates. And Yates was fascinated with the spirituality of Ireland, the way in which that had often been displaced by Christian culture, specifically by a British colonial version of that. But Yates throughout his life wrestled with big spiritual questions. And we get that in early work, early romantic work like The Stolen Child, which layers in kind of fairy mythology, also into a way of thinking about modernity, the modern world, and the kind of difference between those two kinds of things. He uses a phrase a little later called the Celtic twilight, which is a lovely and suggestive phrase. It was later mocked by his fellow countryman James Joyce, who kind of had a more irreverent attitude to the Irish past. So that's one figure, and he writes about what we now think of as kind of apocalyptic ideas of the world on the brink of something new, possibly destructive as well. Very famously in a poem of 1920 called The Second Coming, he worries about what it is that's coming to the earth. Is it going to be a benign judge, or what is it that's going to be born, as he says, slouching towards Bethlehem? So that's Yates and his kind of later apocalyptic view, of course influenced by things like the First World War, and the terrible loss of life in that, but much more recently even the Russian Revolution. All these things feed into his work. So there are spiritual, theological ideas that feed into a political worldview, and they're reflected in poetry. Yates also really famously uses a phrase in his work where he says that prose is the argument that we have with other people. Poetry is the argument we have with ourselves. You won't hear me speak for very long without me quoting that. It's a kind of maxim for me in lots of ways. And I'm always interested in the argument we have with ourselves. I think that's going on in his work. Side by side with that, later in the week, I'll be thinking about a 20th century writer called James Baldwin. Very much associated with the American Civil Rights Movement, somebody who spent time in Europe, specifically in France, somebody who was really calling his peers out on the embedded nature of racism and homophobia, for example. But in the 1960s, he writes a volume of letters, really, letters to his nephews, which are called The Fire Next Time. Now, like the Second Coming, they have an apocalyptic origin. In fact, they're quotations really from what we think of as gospel songs. So he compares the story of the flood to a kind of a fear of a coming judgment. Now, Baldwin didn't write as somebody who was devout in a conventional way, but he absolutely saw the human value of religion, which is one of the reasons I think it's so important to come to terms with these things, whatever we happen to believe.